So I'll say db exception, and then I'm back to my normal. I'll tell the problem that I'm having. I can't connect to the database. Check this out. Okay, obviously your error message might be a bit more descriptive than this. Check this out. And this is error 1005. Here's my error exception code. Alright, so in the catch block, now here's where it gets interesting. In the catch block, rather than saying exception, I'm expecting the exceptions object, I'm not expecting the exceptions object. This time I created a db exception object, which is extending that, and I'm throwing this object. So I'm expecting this object, and I'll call it E again. It's up to you what you call yours. And I'll say E. I want you to first send an email to me telling me what the hell just happened. Okay, this is gonna echo out, and then after that I want you to give me the message, which is E get message. Notice as soon as I typed E, I said get, I have all the messages that are in the original exceptions because I'm extending the exceptions class. So there's no problem in that. So I say get message, and I can include all the other helpful information. Okay, now this time what we did was, first we said let's extend the exception class and we'll name it whatever we want to, and then I defined my own personal helpful method in it, which is in this case going to send me an email of the problem that I'm having. And then inside the try block I said let's throw the exception, and I did with all the helpful information, the error exception code that I want, that I think is going to be helpful in me categorizing my exceptions. And then I caught that exception of the object that I have created. So if you're throwing exception here directly from the exceptions class, this is not going to catch that. This is expecting a db exception object. So to be on the safe side, what you can do is you can say, well, catch an exception object, and we'll also call that E. Okay, and we'll do something similar to that here with the title. We are in the exception class. So we have this now. So in this case, at first I'm going to use the newly customized exception that we have. Now this is going to be helpful, as I told you in the beginning. If you have an exceptions, if you want to keep your database exception separate and you want to have separate routines for it, like sending an email, that's great. If for your regular users member setting area where they can't change something or there's a problem with their logo, you can create a user exception, have that extend the exceptions class, and put in your own methods which you think are going to be specific to it, like saving it to the database. So that's different. Okay, it's going to be helpful for you. I'm going to go ahead and launch this. Hopefully it will work, and yes, it has. The email has been sent. Really hasn't, but it looks like it. Now the message is I can't connect to the database. Check this out. Very helpful. If I wanted to, I include the line numbers and all that other crazy junk. So that's customizing an exception. You learn how to throw new objects. In this case, you can also create a user exception object, but you have to create a class that extends the exception object. I can't see it here, can you? You have to create a class that extends the exception object, and then you can create your methods, then call the try block and catch it, and the catch has to be from here. Now let's go back and let's say for some odd reason that rather than typing db exception we just went with this. Will this still be caught? Yes, we are in the exception class and we've caught it, but in this case your email has not been sent. This is kind of like a fallback on within your own try block. Okay, so that's where we're at, and we're going to move on to the next phase. Let me explain this code as well. It's going to be real quick. First I showed you how to throw a new exception, which is very generic, and then we move on to our own custom class exceptions, and we've created that. We're just throwing the object, and then we're saying here's a try block, we're throwing the custom exception that we've created, and then we're catching that custom exception by writing down its name. And inside here, I'm creating the custom exception. Now, notice there's something different here. Let me just kind of just do this. Any second. Now, here we go. Now, what I'm doing is I'm creating the custom exception, extending from the exception class, and then there's nothing inside that exception. Meaning, I just want this created. I don't need a specific method in it. I just want this created so I can just categorize my own exceptions for now. And you can do that. Nothing wrong with it. Okay? So now let's move on to exception chaining, which is another interesting part of it. Exception chaining is, let's say that you're creating an application, and inside of it, what you're doing is you're updating the user's profile. Okay? And when you're updating the user's profile, you call a method that's going to update the profile, and that in turn calls a method that is going to use the database to update the profile. So what you do is you find out that the database can't be connected to. So the first exception that's thrown is, with the DB exception, our custom class exception, it says we can't connect to the database. It throws that exception. And it throws it where? To the user class, which is trying to update its profile. And what does it do? It catches that exception. There's a DB exception. But rather than just stop there, it adds its own information to it. And it says, couldn't update the user's profile, and here's the user's profile ID. You can add that in there. And then you can add your own code in there. In my case, I just chose to go with this one. And lastly, what you do is this. You add the object that you just caught. So in this case, I said DB exception E. And that's the object. Now add it to the last part of the argument. And if you go back here, you'll notice that first I give the error message, then I give the code, which in my case could be 10012205, and then the exception. This is the exception object of the exception that has just occurred. So in this case, we threw a DB exception, and all the error that's related to this exception, the line, the file, all the message, is inside this object. And we include this object, and then we throw a new exception. So all this information of the old exception is added, and then we add new information. That look, user wasn't able to update his profile information, and here's new information about that. So now we have two exceptions chained together. Okay? And we say throw a new exception of user exception, which is extending the exceptions class, and then we move down. Now we have to see who's calling this update profile. Hopefully this is within a try block, and it is. Within the try block, I'm calling the user update profile with this information. Once an exception is thrown, again you'll notice that this was also called within the try block. Once the exception was thrown, we go here. Now notice something very interesting. I'm throwing a user exception. Since I have not defined a catch block that is catching a user exception, it's gonna say, okay, fine, I'll go back to the exception then, the plain exception class. So if the particular one that you define is not found, it will settle for this one. And once it does find this one, it'll catch that object and will come down here and say, and in this case I've changed the code just a little bit. Okay, so rather than just saying get the message and that's all there is, this time we have more than one exception inside of this one object. So what I do is I said do, I'm using the do while, and in this case I'm saying get the message, get the line this occurred on, and get the file. And then if you look at the while part of it, I'm saying get the previous. Now this method get previous, if you look back here, this get previous is going to get the previous exception that was thrown. So the first one is obviously going to be this one, okay, and then the second one is going to be the database. So we'll go get the previous one, which is the database. If there's another exception chained to it after that one, you'll just keep on getting that information and displaying it here. You can put this inside of a variable and then email it to yourself, or you can save it into the database, or you can do whatever you want with it. But this is how you chain exceptions together. It's helpful stuff. Let's do something with that. We'll go here. In my case, I created a DB class. Okay, it's going to update a user, and in my case, I just said as soon as somebody's going to call this, I'm going to say that there's a problem, and yes, there's a problem. we need to throw a DB exception. I put my information inside of that, and that's thrown. As soon as this is thrown, this line will not be printed. Again, as soon as an exception is thrown, anything after that within the try block does not get executed. It just passes on. Then there's the user class below that, and it has the update profile part. In the update profile, I get the basic user information. I try to create a DB object, okay? And once I have that object, I create a try block, and within that, I try to update the user. And then as soon as I update this user, which is here, an exception is going to be thrown, which is the DB exception. The DB exception then is called this catch block, and I do something very particular with it. I give the user's information. I take the DB exception object, okay? I add it to the very end of this exception. So I'm throwing another exception. I add this object to the very end, which is the third argument, and then I say I'm going to throw a user exception. Here's the user's ID, all the information, and then I'll say this is the exception code, and I'm going to throw this information. Okay, so somebody needs to catch this. So let's see who has it. We scroll down, and we scroll down further. We'll see there's a try block, and it's calling the mine function. Inside the mine function, what I'm doing is I'll explain what I'm doing here. Over here, I'm creating the my object and user object. I'm passing in the update profile some very hardcore information, and you'll see that this is in the try block. So as soon as this exception is called, it's caught with this user exception. And what I do is, as soon as I catch this, I'm throwing it another time. So this time 3 exceptions are linked together. And I take this E, I put it at the very end, which is the third argument, and I add some basic stuff. The user profile has been updated, stop everything, and then I put in the code. You can put in 0 if you want, which is the default. I throw this exception, and again this is being called from this try block, and this time the last stop exception is caught. Last stop, that's the object we created. Notice I didn't put exception this time, because you don't have to. This is something I was doing. And then I do the whole do while clause, where I go through every single exception that we have, and I put the information down. Okay, and that's the whole linking of them. One thing you need to notice is last stop, the last stop, user exception, DB exception, they're all extending the basic exception class. And for this one particularly, I didn't further define any methods, even though for the DB exception I can define a send email part, or define it for all of these things. I can, but I'm just leaving that up to you. Okay, so we're going to move down to the exception code. I've already explained this to you. If you missed on it, you can just kind of go back to the beginning of the tutorial and look at it. Now, the last conclusion part of this is that I'm a wonderful human being that taught this to you. No, the conclusion is that, look, there's exceptions and then there's errors. Exceptions is something that is happening out of the ordinary. Focus on that whenever you create exceptions, because you want to find out the flaws or logical flaws that are in your application, or even external dependencies you have. So if you're accessing a third-party tool or anything like that, and you want to know, as soon as this thing fails, I want to be updated on it. I want to know how many times it's failed. I want to know how smoothly this process is going for my users. Rather than relying on your users to update you, you can have your code give you more information on that. I hope this was useful for you. If it was, please go to my website, give me some comments, or give some comments wherever you're watching this video. Have a great day. Bye.